Good evening. My name is Cody, and this is Discussion Board 4. And I did my research project on the role that slavery played in the development of Virginia in the 1700s up until the Revolution and after. And I used many different sources, some of which were Robert Beverley's The History of Virginia, uh, Sylvia Frey's Between Slavery and Freedom, Christopher Pearl's Conceived in Crisis, and Justin Roberts' Race and Origins of Plantation Slavery. And to basically sum things up, just during the colonization of North America, Virginia was the first permanent settlement of Europeans. And throughout the history of the United States, Virginia played a very crucial role in the development of the country. And when trying to understand the formation and growth of the United States, it's important that you look at Virginia. It has a long and interesting history that needs to be examined carefully. And starting with Virginia's agricultural industry, it played a vital role in the expansion of Virginia and its rise to its power as an economic power and as a political power. And this would not be possible without slavery. Virginia participated in transatlantic slavery. They needed cheap labor. And as a result of this cheap labor, the state was able to grow into what it is today. And in order to understand the United States as a whole, it's important to examine how Virginia was both the birthplace of slavery and freedom in the New World. So as we know, the first permanent settlement in America was Jamestown, Virginia, and this was by the Virginia Company of London in 1607. And within a few years of the colony being established, the demand for labor greatly outweighed the supply of labor. There was just much more to be done than there were people available. And at first, they used indentured servants. It would help keep up with demand. But as other European nations started using slave labor in their colonies, the English decided they should do the same, and eventually slave labor replaced indentured servants. And in the beginning, the slave labor was mostly Native Americans that were captured, but in 1619, the first African American slaves were brought to Virginia, and the following year this number doubled. And by 1650, approximately 300 African Americans were documented in Virginia. And to compare that to just a few hundred years later, when George Washington was alive, he had 300 slaves himself. So slavery was legal in Virginia by the 1660s on the books, like in law, it was written law as it was legal. And Virginia had become largely dependent on slavery for labor. Virginia was originally a place that people went to seeking a new and better life. It was seen as an opportunity by Europeans to expand their wealth, and the cash crop business began to spring up in Virginia. And as the cash crops took off, the need for more labor took off, thus the slave population greatly increased. And workers were in demand. People wanted resources and products from the New World, and the use of free slave labor was obviously the cheapest way to do this. So by the 1700s, slavery had greatly expanded, and slavery in Virginia was rapidly growing. Fields and farms were getting larger and larger. They were becoming huge plantations, and the larger the plantation, the more slaves that were needed. Tobacco had taken off as a cash crop industry, and it was being grown everywhere as much as they could grow, and they needed more and more and more slaves. And eventually, slaves were getting tired of the way they were treated. They rose up in a rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion, and the result of this were slave owners became even more brutal than they were before. And from kind of that point on, they got the brutal slave master reputation that we think of today. And just for a kind of fun fact, well, not fun, but a fact, is that By the time the Civil War happened, nearly one-third of Virginia's population was actually African slaves, or slaves of African heritage. And so in the early 1700s, Virginia had expanded into what is now Ohio, and as the state increased its territory, the need for slaves also increased. After the French and Indian War, Virginia got even more territory, so the demand of slaves kept rising, and eventually, despite the Appalachian Mountains being the kind of marking point of where the colonists were supposed to stop by the Proclamation of 1763, colonists went past it into Native American territory anyway, and Virginia, because of this, grew to encompass modern-day Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of Ohio. But by the 1770s, war between England and the colonies was more and more likely and becoming ever obvious that it was going to happen. And Virginia kind of stepped up to lead the nation's fight for independence. And it's kind of interesting that Virginia would play such a crucial role in getting freedom for the colonists, while also being the place that enslavement started in the United States. So slavery had taken root in all aspects of colonial life by this point. The Slave Code of 1705 had been passed, so the majority of slavery was now taking place on plantations. Small family farms might have had a few slaves, but the large majority of slaves were on these few large plantations spread throughout the South. And by the 1750s, natural reproduction had taken over as the main source of slavery. So by 1770, more than 90% of slaves in Virginia were born in the Americas. So at this point, they weren't getting slaves from Africa anymore. They were just being produced by the slaves reproducing with each other. So after the Revolutionary War, slavery increased even more. With the newfound freedom, the colonists expanded the country, and as the country expanded, the use of slavery also expanded. And it's just kind of a paradox that the Founding Fathers would often use the phrase, all men are created equal, while owning men themselves. And it's widely recognized that they were only talking about white men when they were talking about this. And since the early 1600s up until after the Civil War, Virginia's economy was primarily driven by slavery. So, as slavery was the driving force behind the Virginia economy, it pushed it from the small colony that it began in Jamestown up until the largest player in the political discourse in the Revolutionary War and after. The majority of the presidents have come from Virginia, and it's just become a large, important piece of our nation's history. And over time, slavery had spread across the United States, not just in the South, it was even in the North. And despite this, it was born in the state of Virginia, and it was directly responsible for pushing Virginia's economy and for making Virginia into what it was today. The first legal case of slavery was in Virginia, or the first legal case of slavery in the United States was in Virginia. And that's where also the most well-known slave rebellion took place. There were nearly 500,000 slaves in Virginia by 1860, and this set it apart from every other state in the Union. In spite of the end of slavery in the United States, racism is obviously still a thing. It's lasted until today. And Virginia has been a key player in this as well, in both the Civil Rights Movement and in the Jim Crow era before. So in conclusion, it's just interesting to examine how the state that gave birth to the United States, freedom, and to just the idea of a new world where you can move and be free, was also the place that gave birth to plantation slavery in the Americas. And while the United States wasn't the largest slaveholding country, I think it was Brazil, it still was one of the major role players in slavery in the Americas. And it's just interesting how freedom was allowed to grow and prosper in Virginia thanks to slavery. Without slavery, Virginia would not have been able to grow into what it became, and freedom in America would not have been able to develop the way it did. Slaves and the economy, or slaves' impact on the economy, was necessary for the United States to be able to grow into the country that it did. And the need for a large scale labor force that was cheap and nearly free uh, outweighed the consciousness of the founding fathers. So it's just important to remember how slavery directly contributed to the development of Virginia and how Virginia directly contributed to the birth of the United States.